The phone vibrates at 4:17 a.m. Most people sleep through it. Those awake assume it's an Amber Alert, a weather warning, something routine. But the screen glows different this time. National Defense Alert. Multiple incidents detected. Remain indoors. Await further instruction. 300 million phones receive the same message within seconds. Nobody knows what multiple incidents means. The government doesn't clarify. They can't, because in the first 6 hours of World War III, the people making decisions know less than you think. This isn't Hollywood's version of global war. There's no presidential speech, no clear enemy, no obvious target. Just confusion, cascading failures, and 6 hours of the most dangerous uncertainty in human history. By the time anyone understands what's real, the war has already begun. Hour 1. The Phantom Strike rewind 23 minutes. At 3:54 a.m., something triggers North American Aerospace Defense Command. A radar signature appears over the Arctic. Fast-moving, high altitude. Trajectory suggests continental United States. NORAD has 6 minutes to decide if this is real. The object travels at hypersonic speed. Too fast for commercial aircraft, too high for weather phenomena. Computer systems flag it as potential ICBM, Intercontinental Ballistic Missile. At 4 a.m., NORAD alerts the Pentagon. Within 3 minutes, the Secretary of Defense connects with the President on secure line. The conversation lasts 47 seconds. Mr. President, we have possible incoming strike. We need authorization for defensive measures. How certain are you? We're assessing. Translation. We don't know. But uncertainty kills in nuclear warfare. Wait for perfect information, you're already dead. At 4:08 a.m., the decision comes. Alert the population. Activate defense systems. Prepare for impact. The missiles that launch from silos across Montana and North Dakota aren't nuclear. They're interceptors designed to destroy incoming warheads before they reach American soil. At 4:11 a.m., 6 interceptor missiles streak across the pre-dawn sky. Their target, the mysterious object approaching from the north. At 4:15 a.m., they make contact. The explosion happens 200 miles above Alaska, bright enough to be seen from Anchorage. The blast creates an electromagnetic pulse that knocks out satellite communications across the Arctic. At 4:16 a.m., NORAD confirms successful intercept. At 4:17 a.m., the alert goes to every phone in America. But here's what they don't tell the public. They still don't know what they shot down. Russian missile? Chinese? North Korean? Or something else entirely? That debris scatters across 500 square miles of Alaskan wilderness. It will take 18 hours to reach the crash site. By then, World War III will be in full swing. Because while America celebrates stopping a nuclear attack, the rest of the world sees something different. They see America firing missiles into international airspace. They see a first strike. Within minutes, military bases across Europe go to high alert. Russian submarines in the Arctic dive to combat depth. Chinese naval forces in the South China Sea begin rapid deployment procedures. Nobody knows who fired first. Everyone assumes they're next. At 4:42 a.m., the first international incident occurs. A Russian reconnaissance aircraft monitoring the situation in Alaska strays into Canadian airspace. Canadian F-18s scramble to intercept. The Russian pilot, confused by conflicting orders and radio interference from the EMP blast, makes a hard turn south. Canadian pilots interpret this as aggressive maneuvering. One pilot achieves radar lock. The Russian aircraft immediately drops chaff and flares, defensive countermeasures that, to the Canadians, look like preparation for attack. At 4:44 a.m., a Canadian F-18 fires a warning shot. The Russian pilot panics. He's carrying classified surveillance equipment, cannot allow his aircraft to be forced down. He accelerates toward international waters. The Canadian pilot, following rules of engagement, fires again. This time it's not a warning. At 4:46 a.m., a Russian military aircraft is shot down over the Beaufort Sea. Moscow receives the news at 11:46 a.m. local time. The reaction is swift and predictable. Within an hour, Russian forces mobilize along the European border. NATO responds in kind. But here's the crucial detail. None of these decisions are based on actual intelligence. They're based on assumption, fear, and the terrible logic of nuclear deterrence. If your enemy might be preparing to attack, you have to prepare to attack first. If your allies are under threat, you must threaten their attacker. If someone makes a move, you make a counter-move. By 5:30 a.m., less than 2 hours after the first alert, military forces across 3 continents move toward conflict. And still, nobody knows what's real. Hour 2, the cascade effect. At 5:47 a.m., European command goes to DA-FACON 2. The decision comes from a 34-year-old intelligence analyst in Stuttgart who notices something odd in satellite data. Russian mobile missile launchers, normally stored in hardened bunkers, are being moved to field positions. The movement began at 5:15 a.m. Moscow time, 30 minutes after news of the downed aircraft reached the Kremlin. To NATO analysts, this looks like preparation for first strike. Mobile launchers are harder to target than fixed silos. You only move them when you're planning to use them. At 5:52 a.m., Supreme Allied Commander Europe authorizes Operation Shield Wall. Within minutes, American bombers at RAF Fairford began pre-flight procedures. German Patriot batteries across Bavaria come online. French submarines in the Mediterranean change course toward the Eastern Basin. But here's what analysts don't know. Russia is responding to intelligence suggesting NATO is preparing a preemptive strike. At 5:33 a.m. Moscow time, a Russian signals intelligence station in Kaliningrad intercepts NATO communications traffic that's increased 400% in the past hour. Encrypted burst transmissions between London and the Pentagon. Sudden changes in U.S. submarine patrol patterns in the Norwegian Sea. To Russian commanders, the pattern is unmistakable. NATO is positioning for attack. The mobile launchers aren't being prepared for first strike. They're being dispersed to survive one. At 6:21 a.m., the first incident occurs in the Baltic Sea. USS Porter, an Arleigh Burke-class destroyer, conducts routine patrol operations 47 nautical miles from Kaliningrad. Routine until this morning. Porter's radar detects fast-moving aircraft approaching from Russian airspace. 2 Su-27 fighters flying low and fast. The Russian pilots have orders to monitor NATO naval activity. But they're young, nervous, and aware that tensions are escalating rapidly. When they see Porter's defensive systems come online standard procedure when unknown aircraft approach, they interpret it as target acquisition. One pilot radios back to base. American destroyer has achieved radar lock, requesting permission to engage. The message reaches Russian Naval Command at the worst possible moment. Analysts are reporting NATO submarines moving aggressively in the Arctic, mobile missile launchers still deploying across western Russia. And now an American destroyer appears to be targeting Russian aircraft. At 6:23 a.m., the response comes. You are cleared to defend yourself. The Russian pilot doesn't fire, but he does something almost as provocative. He arms his air-to-surface missiles and begins an attack run on Porter. The American ship's close-in weapon system automatically activates. The Siebes is designed to stop incoming missiles, but its radar signature looks identical to target acquisition for offensive weapons. To the Russian pilot, the American destroyer just locked on to him with surface-to-air missiles. At 6:24 a.m., he releases 2 Kh-31 anti-ship missiles and banks hard to the east. Porter has 32 seconds to respond. The ship's Aegis system tracks the incoming missiles and calculates interception solutions. Standard procedure is to use standard missile interceptors. But Porter's captain makes a split-second decision that changes everything. Instead of just defending, he orders a counterattack. Porter launches 4 Tomahawk cruise missiles toward the last known position of the Russian aircraft. The missiles streak across the Baltic at 550 miles per hour, but the Russian fighters are already gone, racing back to Kaliningrad at maximum speed. The Tomahawks continue on their programmed course. They cross into Russian territorial waters at 6:31 a.m. Russian coastal defenses, on high alert for the past 2 hours, track the incoming American missiles. Defense computers calculate multiple impact points: Kaliningrad Naval Base, Maltese Naval Facility, and Kaliningrad Airport. At 6:32 a.m., Russia's automated defense systems engage. The engagement lasts 4 minutes. When it's over, 3 American cruise missiles have been destroyed. One gets through. It impacts a Russian radar installation 12 kilometers southeast of Kaliningrad. The explosion kills 17 Russian servicemen and destroys critical early warning equipment. At 6:37 a.m., Russia is under attack by the United States. The news reaches the Kremlin at 9:37 a.m. local time. President Putin is in a secure briefing room receiving updates on the escalating situation in the Arctic. When the report comes in, the room goes silent. American missiles have struck Russian territory. Russian personnel are dead. The attack came without warning or provocation. From Moscow's perspective, this is exactly what their intelligence predicted. NATO was preparing a first strike. Now it has begun. At 6:45 a.m. Eastern Time, Russian forces across Europe receive new orders. Prepare for immediate combat operations. Hour 3. Point of no return. At 7:12 a.m., the president's phone rings. He's been awake for 3 hours monitoring the situation from the White House Situation Room. What started as a possible missile attack has evolved into a crisis spanning 3 continents. The call is from the Secretary of Defense. His voice is steady, but there's something in the tone that makes everyone in the room stop talking. Mr. President, we have a developing situation in the Baltic. Porter engaged Russian aircraft. There was an exchange of fire. We believe we hit a Russian installation. The President asks the obvious question. What kind of installation? We're still assessing. But, sir, the Russians are mobilizing. Significant movement across their western military districts. We're tracking increased submarine activity in the Arctic and North Atlantic. And he pauses. And what? Sir, we've lost contact with 3 of our submarines. Their last known positions were in areas where Russian anti-submarine activity has increased dramatically. Room temperature seems to drop. Losing contact with nuclear submarines is never routine. In a crisis, it means one of 2 things. They're either hiding from an enemy or they've been found by one. At 7:18 a.m., the Joint Chiefs of Staff unanimously recommend raising America's nuclear alert status to DEFCON 1, the highest level, the point where nuclear weapons are prepared for immediate launch. The President hesitates. DEFCON 1 hasn't been declared since the Cuban Missile Crisis. It's a signal that nuclear war is imminent. Once you cross that line, every action becomes a countdown to the end of civilization. But the alternative might be worse. If Russia is preparing to launch a first strike, America needs to be ready to respond within minutes, not hours. At 7:24 a.m., the United States military goes to DEFCON 1. The order propagates through command centers across the globe. Missile silos in Montana, North Dakota, and Wyoming begin launch preparation sequences. Strategic bombers at Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri begin rolling toward runways. Nuclear submarines in the Atlantic and Pacific receive authentication codes for their ballistic missiles. America's nuclear triad land-based missiles, submarines, and bombers shift to hair-trigger alert status. Any of these systems can launch within 15 minutes of receiving authorization. But here's the deadly paradox of nuclear deterrence. The better your weapons work, the more likely they are to be used. At 7:31 a.m., a Russian reconnaissance satellite detects the American bomber movements. The images are relayed to Moscow in real time. To Russian analysts, the pattern is unmistakable. American strategic bombers are being dispersed to launch positions. This is classic first strike preparation. You spread your assets to prevent the enemy from destroying them in a preemptive attack. At 7:38 a.m. Moscow time, Russia begins its own nuclear alert procedures. The decision is made in a bunker 200 feet beneath the Kremlin. President Putin, surrounded by military advisors, authorizes special combat readiness for Russia's strategic forces. Russian mobile missile launchers already dispersed across the countryside begin their final preparation sequences. Submarines in the Arctic dive to launch depth. Bombers at Engels Air Base near Saratov begin engine startup procedures. At 7:47 a.m. Eastern Time, American satellites detect the Russian response. The National Security Advisor delivers the news in a single sentence. Mr. President, Russia just went to nuclear alert. For the first time in human history, both superpowers have their entire nuclear arsenals ready for immediate launch. The combined destructive power pointed across the Arctic is enough to end human civilization. All it takes is one mistake. At 8:03 a.m., they get one. Hour 4, the fog of war. A Norwegian fishing vessel, the Bjørn Eriksson, operates in international waters 120 nautical miles north of Tromsø. The crew of 6 has been at sea for 4 days fishing for Arctic cod. They have no idea that World War III is beginning above their heads. The fish finder detects something large moving beneath their boat. The sonar signature is huge, metallic, and moving at depth. Captain Eric Hagen assumes it's a whale. He's wrong. USS Connecticut, a Seawolf-class attack submarine, is conducting reconnaissance operations in the Norwegian Sea. The Sub has been tracking increased Russian submarine activity for the past hour. When Connecticut's sonar operator detects surface activity directly above them, he alerts the captain. "Skipper, we have surface contact. Multiple vessels. Unknown configuration." The captain orders the submarine to periscope depth. At 8:03 a.m., Connecticut rises from the deep. As the periscope breaks the surface, the captain sees the fishing vessel 200 meters away. A routine encounter that should end with Connecticut diving to avoid detection. But these aren't routine circumstances. At the same moment Connecticut reaches periscope depth, Captain Hagen activates his boat's emergency radio beacon. The Björn Eriksson's engine has been making irregular sounds all morning. Hagen wants to report his position to the Coast Guard in case they need assistance. The radio transmission is picked up by multiple listeners. Norwegian Coast Guard, Russian Signals Intelligence Stations in Murmansk, and USS Connecticut. To Connecticut's sonar operator, the sudden radio burst from a surface. Vessel directly overhead looks exactly like a submarine hunter calling in the position of a submerged target. "Captain, surface vessel is transmitting our position on emergency frequencies." The implication is terrifying. The fishing vessel may have detected Connecticut and is relaying its position to hostile forces. The captain has seconds to decide. If Russian attack submarines are converging, he must dive and prepare to fight. But diving means losing the surface contact, and if that vessel is guiding an attack, letting it escape could be fatal. At 8:04 a.m., Connecticut fires a single torpedo, set to detonate nearby as a warning. The blast throws Björn Eriksson from the water. When it slams back down, it's already sinking. 3 crewmen die. At 8:06 a.m., a mayday reaches Norway. Minutes later, NATO concludes the unthinkable. An American submarine has killed Norwegian civilians. Hour 5, the information war. At 9:17 a.m., the headlines explode. CNN reports a submarine battle in Arctic waters. The BBC describes a clash between NATO and Russian forces. RT declares an American attack on civilians, proof of NATO aggression. Each audience is shown a different war. Americans see Russian forces hiding behind civilian ships. Russians see innocent fishermen slaughtered by NATO. Europeans see 2 nuclear powers violating neutral waters. Social media turns confusion into chaos. Viral videos claim to show the battle footage from old military exercises. Eyewitness posts contradict each other. Rumors spread of missing warheads and secret orders that never existed. Truth drowns in volume. At 9:23 a.m., the White House issues a carefully worded statement. American forces were attacked, acted in self-defense, and are investigating civilian casualties. Hours later, Moscow responds with its own version: an unprovoked American strike, innocent deaths, and the right to retaliate. Both statements are technically true. Both are dangerously misleading. And the real danger is this: leaders in Washington and Moscow are watching the same headlines as everyone else, while facts lag behind the speed of news. At 9:31 a.m., a CNN reporter, citing Pentagon sources, claims that Russian submarines may have nuclear weapons aboard. The report is based on speculation, but it spreads across social media as confirmed fact. At 9:34 a.m., a Russian military blogger posts detailed analysis proving that the attack on Björn Eriksson was a false flag operation designed to justify NATO aggression. The post is shared 50,000 times in 20 minutes. Information spreads faster than truth. Every fragment is twisted, amplified, and consumed by audiences desperate for certainty. By 9:45 a.m., 3 nations believe 3 different realities. American polls demand action against Russian submarines. Russian citizens demand retaliation against NATO aggression. Norway questions its place in the alliance itself. Politics hardens. Militaries feel the pressure. The spiral accelerates. Hour 6. The edge of oblivion. At 10:43 a.m., the president faces an impossible choice. Intelligence floods the Situation Room. Russian submarine movements, Arctic air activity, surging communications across Siberia. None prove an attack is coming. All suggest something big is unfolding. The options are grim. Hold position and hope, pull back and risk weakness, or prepare for the worst. The president asks the only question that matters: what if we're wrong? At 10:47 a.m., he authorizes defensive positioning. Bombers remain on alert. Submarines hold course. Naval patrols increase without crossing red lines. A careful balance meant to deter, not provoke. Russia sees something else entirely. Within minutes, Moscow responds. Missile launchers disperse. Bombers patrol the Arctic. Fleets shift to combat formation. American satellites detect everything. By 11 a.m., both superpowers are convinced the other is preparing to strike, and in the logic of nuclear deterrence, they're both right. Defense looks exactly like attack. At 11:18 a.m., satellite images suggest Russian submarine launch preparations. If missiles fly, America will have minutes to respond. Outside, the world goes on. Inside, civilization holds its breath. The clock reads 11:28 a.m. 6 hours ago, the world was at peace. Now it's 6 minutes from ending,